This happened to me, and I still feel it in my hands when I pick up my phone. It wasn't a campfire rumor or a friend of a friend tale. This was my life unraveling and then knitting itself back together in a Chicago courtroom. We were outside courtroom 2508 in the Daily Center, the air smelling like toner and cold coffee, when my son-in-law leaned in over the scuffed wooden bench and hissed, "You'll never win this case." His breath carried spearmint and arrogance. His knuckles tapped the yellow legal folder on my lap, the one with a cracked iPhone sealed in a Ziploc bag and printouts of his messages. My daughter stood a few feet away, her eyes glassy, staring at the Picasso across the way, through the tall windows, like it might bend down and give her advice. The clerk called the morning calendar, and in that hum, I felt it, the click of a trap, finally, maybe, about to spring. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I'm 61, and I've lived in Bridgeport my whole life. The kind of Chicagoan who gives directions by bakeries and L-tracks. For 27 years, I ran a flower shop on Halsted called Blue Iris and Vine, the sort of place that still wraps bouquets in brown paper and tucked notes by hand. My husband, Danny, passed a decade ago, and I kept the shop not because flowers make money, but because flowers make people hush for a second and feel something kind. My daughter, Claire, started helping when she was 15, crowned prom corsages with pearled pins, and told shy boys how to hold a bouquet like it was something meant for two hands. When she got engaged to Evan, I was relieved in the way a mother is relieved when a storm finally breaks. He was clean-cut, a head of marketing at some tech company up in River North, dazzlingly helpful with spreadsheets and branding talk. He said Instagram needed storytelling, that the shop's font should nudge nostalgia, that the city permit process was a mess he could untangle. He said a lot. He started showing up before opening with coffee from Dark Matter and late-night emails titled Quick Wins. He built us a Shopify site, pointed at a line chart, said the slope could be steeper if we activated holidays. I didn't trust the word activated, but I trusted Claire, whose cheeks flushed when he praised her ideas. We repainted the front door, a color he called robin's egg. Trending, Mom. And switched my supplier for peonies to one of his vendor partners. Valentine's Day came, then Mother's Day, and the numbers climbed. I didn't notice the other things. The extra card reader he installed for data hygiene. The lease renewal he said he'd handle as a time-saving concierge. The new LLC he said we needed, Blue Iris and Vine Holdings, with one signature page, "We can finish later." Finishing later turned into discovering too late that he'd finished without us. I realized it on a Wednesday in late August when my bank card was declined at Costco while I bought vases. The cashier looked at me, then at the roses in my cart, and asked if I had another form of payment. I did, buried in my purse among tape, safety pins, and the emergency Snickers bar I pretend is for bridesmaids. I drove back down Pershing to the shop with a hot face and my stomach gnawing. Evan was there, chatting with a bride at the counter about eucalyptus garlands. When I asked why the business card was declined, he said there was a temporary fraud hold. He tapped his phone to show me an email from the bank. Bold as the skyline, there it was. Dear Mr. Rask, regarding the accounts tied to Blue Iris and Vine Holdings, LLC, I asked him why his name was on the account as primary. He shrugged like a tiny apology and said, "It's just paperwork. I set it up to streamline. You'll be on it, Claire, too. It's a step." He said, "Step the way people say journey when they want to sell you something with glitter." The next morning, I arrived to a new sign. Blue Iris and Vine, a Rask Group company. The letters were vinyl, crisp as a verdict. My name was nowhere. I stood on the sidewalk, the smell of yeast from the bakery next door comforting and stubborn, and I watched a courier deliver a manila envelope to the shop. Evan opened it with a fingernail and smiled in a way that made my molars ache. "Good news," he said, waving the lease renewal. "We locked in 5 more years." He didn't look at me. He looked past me, like the doorframe was his mirror. When I asked where my signature line was, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll take care of the legacy paperwork later." Later turned out to be the following week, when I came to open and found the locks changed. Claire had texted me the night before that she was staying at Evans because they were crunching numbers. That morning, the window glittered with our hydrangea display, the soft blue echoing the front door, and the handle wouldn't budge. My key turned, caught, and stopped. A smear of adhesive clung to the doorknob like a bruise. A man in a gray polo came out from inside. Someone new. Said they were under new management. He asked if I was there for the 9 o'clock interview. "I'm the owner," I told him. He looked at my hands, cracked from cold water and thorns. "Talk to corporate," he said, and closed my door in my face. I tried calling Claire, and the call went to voicemail. She didn't pick up at noon. At 2, she texted, "Mom, can we talk later? Please don't come to the shop today. Everything is volatile." Volatile. Another activated word. I took the 8 bus home and sat at my kitchen table, where the formica is peeling in one corner like a page you lift and never glue down, because doing so would feel like admitting the book is over. The little silver radio by the stove murmured WXRT. I stared at the lemon bowl, stupidly bright, and thought, he put me outside my own life. When I finally opened the manila folder mailed to my apartment that night, a registered letter I had to sign for at the post office, I found a formal notice. Effective immediately, I was terminated as manager of Blue, Iris, and Vine for cause, citing repeat irregularities in cash handling and insubordination regarding brand standards. There was a cease and desist order against using the business name. There was a paper with my own shaky signature, photocopied next to Blue Iris and Vine Holdings, LLC operating agreement, and under it, a clause giving managing authority to Evan Rask for a term of 5 years. I don't sign like that, I thought. Not that loopy tail on the E. My hands shook the folder so hard the lemon bowl rattled. By the time I finished crying that night, I already knew 3 things. First, he had convinced my daughter that the business was something separate from the 2 of us. Second, he had forged my name on at least 1 document, and maybe several. Third, he had no idea what an old woman can do when you take away the thing that kept her breathing. I lifted the cracked iPhone in its Ziploc, the one I use at the shop for taking orders, and thought, "You chatterbox, what did you save for me?" Because I let iCloud back up, and if Evan is as clever as he believes, he texted from the shop iPad he let me borrow, the one I stuffed in my tote-on that last night when I still had keys. The last text on that iPad, to Claire, glowed like a match head. "Don't worry, babe. paper is just paper. She won't fight. I slept with the folder under my pillow, as if proximity might make the pages rewrite themselves, and woke up with a plan that tasted like steel. I called a woman from St. Barbara's who does bookkeeping for half the neighborhood. Her name is Lydia, and she's the only person I know who can make debits purr. She came with a tote full of highlighters and 2 pairs of glasses she stacks when numbers get thin. "We'll begin with the accounts," she said, patting my forearm like a cat settling on a lap. "And we won't stop till we know where your money ran." She smelled like lilacs and determination. We spread receipts on my table like tarot and looked for the same card in every row. Round and round the vase the stems go, and somewhere in the water, rot begins. That was the day I realized I wasn't the only one he underestimated. The man in the gray polo had slipped. The courier had smiled. The neighborhood had watched. And I wasn't done being the owner of my life. "You'll never win this case," he had said, tapping the yellow folder. He didn't see the zipper bag with the phone, or hear the way Lydia inhaled when she noticed the duplicate bank deposits. One to Blue Iris and Vine Holdings, and one to a new account called BIV Vendor, Services LLC, owner listed, Rask Group, EIN matching. I looked up at her, and she smiled the thin smile of a woman who has found the knot. "Pull here," she said, and I pulled. The first humiliation is the story people expect. A door you can't open, your name erased, a boyfriend who becomes a husband, who becomes a man who calls you hysterical because it's easier than calling you brave. But the second humiliation is quieter. Realizing your daughter believed him when he told her I had old-fashioned ideas about money, that I was sentimental about cash, that the business would die in your hands unless we modernize. Claire and I ate conchas at Panaderia Nuevo Leon the week before the locks changed, and she listened to him on speaker describing inventory shrink, nodding like he was reading clouds. I hated him for the condescension. I hated myself for not teaching her that love is not a credential. By the end of that week, Lydia and I had mapped a river. Payments rerouted to vendor accounts, flower orders placed at inflated prices through a shell that took 15% off the top, deposits swept into a savings account with my shop's name on it, only the shop's name was missing 1 letter. Blue Iris and Vine versus Blue Iris and Vines. I shook my head at the audacity. "People see what they expect to see," Lydia said, tapping the missing S with her nail. "A trick you pick up in church." There were invoices for consultation fees, billed by Rask Group for strategic direction. He had charged us for telling me to paint the door. The sum was large enough to make your tongue go dry. When we cross-referenced the for cause termination letter against the dates of deposits, we saw the true story. The days I supposedly miscounted the drawer, Evan had transferred cash out of a secondary Stripe reader he'd labeled Events Only. That reader's bank deposit, in small amounts, went to an account I would soon learn he used for dinners at Bavette's and bottle service at a place I had to ask my niece to Google. At some point during those late nights, chicken scratch notes, Lydia's readers clinking, my left thumb throbbed in a way that meant my arthritis was talking. I remembered trimming eucalyptus for a wedding, where the bride cried because we'd tucked rosemary into her bouquet in honor of her grandmother's kitchen, and thought, people tell you who they are when they think you can't read the fine print. Evan once bragged at a family Easter at Jean and Giorgetti that he could drive a truck through corporate oversight at his job. "Nobody checks a man in a blazer," he laughed, picking at his lamb. My sister-in-law changed the subject to avoid a fight. I heard only the sound of a man handing me a crowbar. I started keeping a spiral notebook with a list I titled Truths. Truth number 1, he lied about the bank. Truth number 2, he forged at least one signature. Truth number 3, he created shells to siphon money. Truth number 4, if I were him, I would have texted evidence to someone because smug is chatty. Truth number 5, Claire is in love and in danger, and love twists vision. I wrote those lines in a blocky hand because my cursive looks too much like the woman I was when Danny was alive. Then I opened the Ziploc like a nurse peeling a bandage. I am not a technologist, but I know my way around a phone when it matters. That old iPhone had been the shop device for Instagram, and because Evan liked to sync everything, it was logged into an iCloud account tied to the shop email he controlled. He'd given me the password once when I couldn't post a story. He assumed I'd forget. I do forget grocery lists and birthdays and where I set my keys, but when a man throws you out of your own place, your brain goes hawk sharp. I used a spare iPad I'd found under the counter, the one he'd labeled POS2, and tried the password. It worked. I scrolled until my eyes blurred, and then I saw them. The first text that made my jaw lock was to a contact named Vance Graft. "LOL, she still thinks the lease is in her name," Evan had typed. "Watching her sign that envelope was peak. Could have handed her a vacation waiver to Mars." Vance replied with a string of knife emojis, and "tie it up before she gets a shyster." Evan answered, "I told Claire we're protecting her legacy." That word works like catnip. Farther down were screenshots of our QuickBooks, annotated with green arrows and captions like, "Where I pull margin and round-trip this to SVCS." There were also texts to someone named S. Later I'd learn it was a woman who worked in his office, bragging about building an empire out of this dinosaur, and an exchange where he wrote, "Worst case, we keep her fighting for a year, and she runs out of cash. Boomer stamina." I was so mad I couldn't stand. I walked laps around my kitchen table, a motion I used to use when I rocked my colicky baby and told her we were fine. I texted Claire from my phone, my personal one, and typed and erased a dozen times. I landed on, "I love you. I found some things that don't look right. Please come by." She responded, "Mom, not today." I stared at the blue bubbles until they faded and the screen went black like a curtain. The next morning, I hoofed it to the 9:30 a.m. free legal clinic at the DePaul Center on State. The room smelled like overwatered plants, and the volunteer attorney was a woman with gray braids who introduced herself as Marisol. When I unzipped the bag and slid her the iPad and my folder, she didn't blink. "You're doing great," she said, like I was already on the other side of a marathon. "We're going to request the operating agreement and the lease from the landlord. We're going to file a suit to enjoin him from using your name and the shop's assets. And we're going to get you back in your building." I nodded, because nodding is sometimes the only motion that keeps you upright. "And," she added, tapping the iPad, "we're going to preserve these communications before he remote wipes. My nephew will help with a forensic backup this afternoon. For free. He's a good boy. He likes puzzles." I almost cried again, but I was running out of enough water in my body for that. On the way home, I stopped at Lou Mitchell's and ate a plate of eggs that tasted like fortification and history. I watched the train slide into Union Station and imagined each text like a car loading proof, chugging toward a platform labeled Consequence. Before I left, I bought a bag of donut holes for Lydia and a second bag for myself, because I am old enough to know bribes work on accountants and fear requires sugar. When I got home, Marisol's nephew, who everyone called Junior regardless of his actual name, was already on my stoop with a laptop and a grin. He sat up at my table, muttering about hashes and chains, while Lydia tapped expense lines like a drummer keeping time. We printed, we flagged, we ordered pizza from Connie's, and ate standing up. We were building a case out of thin paper and cold anger, and I felt my lungs open. At midnight, Junior leaned back and pointed at the screen. "You need to see this," he said, his fingers leaving a ghost of grease on the glass. He had dug into the iCloud recently deleted and retrieved a thread where Evan rehearsed a text to Claire. "We should keep your mom out of it," he'd typed and erased, then typed again, "She's not well." He followed it with, "We need guardianship while she's in decline. It's compassionate." He had saved the draft, then deleted it. I stood up so fast my chair skidded. Guardianship? Decline? Compassion as a blade. "Print that," I said, and my voice sounded like gravel on the Stevenson at rush hour. "Print all of it." Junior nodded. Lydia put down her highlighter. We were very quiet, like people in church when they realize the sermon is about them. When the printer finished spitting out the last text, I stacked the pages like bricks and felt a primitive, satisfying thud. Outside, a siren wailed. My phone buzzed. It was Claire. "I'll come by tomorrow," she texted. 9. I traced the curve of my daughter's name with my thumb, like I used to trace the swirl at the back of her head when she slept. I looked at the iPad again. Evan had sent a message to Vance an hour earlier. "Worst case, we burn the brand and reopen across town under Rask Floral Concepts. She can keep the carcass." He added a clinking beer emoji. And right then I knew that every kind word he'd ever said to me was a wax fruit, shiny and inedible. I turned out the kitchen light and went to bed with a stack of paper on the chair beside me, like a guard dog. Tomorrow, my daughter would see the words he used. Tomorrow, I would ask her which family she stood in. Tomorrow, I would learn that a woman can love two wrong things at once and call it loyalty until the truth makes her stop. Claire arrived the next morning with a grocery bag of oranges, as if vitamin C could shore up what we were about to do. Her hair was pulled into a clip I'd bought her when she still lived at home, when she used to stand in the bathroom doorway and ask me to braid it. We hugged, a stiff hinge of a gesture, and I set the bag on the counter. The kitchen smelled like printer ink and coffee. The stack of texts sat where sunlight could find them. Claire looked at it, then at me. "Mom," she said, and her voice trembled at the edge. "I need you to trust me. This is bigger than the roses and the register. We have to think about scalability and taxes and—" I held up my hand, palm out. "Sweetheart," I said, "I need you to read." I slid her the first page. Evan telling Vance to tie it up before she gets a shyster. The second, guardianship. The third, the beer clink over the carcass of my life. Claire's eyes moved left to right, faster, then slower. Her shoulders rounded like she wanted to make herself small enough to be held by something that wasn't going to hold her. She put a hand over her mouth, like you see in courtroom dramas when the witness finally understands. She reached for another page, and another. When she reached the one where Evan called her catnip, she made a sound I'd never heard from her. Not a sob, not a gasp, something lower, an animal realizing the leg-hold trap is on bone. She began and stopped. He said, she folded, right there in my kitchen into the chair Danny used to claim, and I sat beside her. I didn't touch her. There's a kind of grief you can't smooth with a hand, the kind that has to rattle loose on its own. He said you were tired, she whispered. He said you wanted to retire. He said the bank needed one name while we figured out your trust. She laughed a humorless little sound. Trust. We spent the morning in the kind of silence only mothers and daughters can survive. At noon, Claire said, "What do we do?" It was the first time she'd said we since the locks changed. I told her about Marisol, about the injunction, about all the paper in the world that can sometimes be stronger than a deadbolt. Claire wiped her face and nodded like someone in a pew finding their prayer. "I'll help," she said. "But, Mom, if we do this, he will come for us." I nodded. "Then let him," I said. He already did. At 2:20, Evan's name lit my phone. I put it on speaker. "Where's Claire?" he said, skipping hello. "Not at the shop." I could hear the espresso machine hissing behind him, the sound of a life he stole. "She's here," I said. "We're reviewing some documents." I let my voice sit low and flat. A good florist knows how to calm a room. A better mother knows how to scare a man. He chuckled. "Mom, let's not make this weird." He didn't call me Mom often. When he did, it was like a man raising his palms to show he's unarmed while he hides a knife behind his back. "We're all on the same side. I've been keeping the wolves from the door." "Guardianship," I said. I heard his breath stop, a little hitch. "The word you used was guardianship. The phrase you used was boomer stamina. And that was charming, truly. But my stamina, as it turns out, is fine." He recovered. "You broke the law accessing my communications," he said lightly. "Claire's communications. That's a federal offense." He loved the cadence of legal language. It made him feel tall. "You put the shop's devices on a shared account," I said, "with shared access. Evan, you've been texting from my property while stealing my property, and you did it in writing because arrogance has bad impulse control." Claire flinched at the phrase. "My property," and I reached for her hand under the table. He sighed. "Look," he said, "this is messy, and I hate that you're uncomfortable. But you cannot win. You do not have the money to outlast me. You do not have the energy. And you certainly do not have the law on your side, however much your street corner lawyers think you do." He inhaled in a performative way and added, "I'm moving us forward with or without you. If you want to salvage a relationship with your daughter—" He let the sentence hang, thick as syrup. "Say hi to Vance," I said, and ended the call. We walked to Marisol's little office on State with the spring chattering in my knee, Claire half a step behind me, like she used to be when she was small and the city felt too loud. Marisol stood when we entered and hugged Claire as if she belonged to her. She slid a petition across the desk, temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, and explained the path: service, hearing, discovery, deposition. I watched Claire take in the words like a storm map. "We have to anticipate his power," Marisol said. "He has money. He has an attorney who will talk like a magician. Look at my left hand while I steal with my right. He will crowd the docket with motions. He will try to make you small. The way we win is by being boring, repeatable, verified, and we will show the judge his words, because men like this text more truth than they speak. We filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County the next morning. The clerk stamped our papers like a metronome. Evan's attorney, sharp suit, loafers the color of espresso, filed a motion to dismiss, claiming I had withered capacity and had consented to a managerial transfer. He attached a physician's note from some concierge practice Evan apparently visited that suggested I might be experiencing age-associated cognitive decline. I laughed right there at the counter, and the clerk raised an eyebrow. The note was signed by a doctor whose receptionist later admitted, after 2 phone calls from Marisol, that Evan had requested a general letter for insurance. The doctor would be thrilled to come to court and clarify that he had never assessed me. I added that to my list of truths. In the days before the hearing, Evan doubled down. He took out an ad in a neighborhood magazine, a smug page with a photo of him standing in my shop, wearing my apron, under my sign, with copy about new leadership and bold direction. He called vendors and told them I was retiring for health reasons. He called my sister, who works at a school in Pilsen, and told her I was spreading rumors. He sent Claire a bouquet, white lilies, the funeral kind, with a card that read, "We can fix this if you come home." She threw them out, and we both hissed when the pollen dusted the trash bag like chalk dust from old sins. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I walked the perimeter of my apartment like a security guard. At 3 a.m., I stood at my window and watched a man on a bicycle in a hoodie skim the block, haloed by the sodium light. The city is never quiet, not even when you think it is. I thought of my husband, who once said, in the flat way men say simple truth, "If you're right and you have paper, you can fight anybody." I whispered back to the dark, "I have paper." My knee throbbed. I lay down, finally, and dreamed of peonies opening, slow and determined, no matter how tight the bud starts. In the morning, I wore the good black slacks that don't pucker, the shoes that don't squeak, and a cardigan. A friend calls my courtroom sweater because its heathered gray makes me look like a librarian with a grudge. Claire wore a dress the color of tea. We rode the bus like regular people to the place where our regular life would be decided. In the elevator to the 25th floor, a man in a tie looked at the papers in my hands and said, "You'll be fine. Judges like moms." I smiled because I didn't have space in my mouth for other words. We sat outside, and Evan approached with his attorney. He leaned down, put his hand on the bench beside my thigh like he might pat my leg, and whispered that line, "You'll never win this case." He straightened, turned his grin to Claire like a lighthouse beam he could aim, and said, "Last chance to be reasonable." I could see his texts, the arrogance, the cruelty, floating above his head like a cartoon's thought bubble. Claire's hand found mine. The clerk opened the door and called the name of my shop, and the sound of it made me realize we were walking into a room where facts would matter more than his smirk if we did it right. So I stood, steadied my knee, and thought, time to let paper speak. Our judge was a woman in her 50s, with a braid coiled tight as a gavel strike. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had the patient expression of someone who's seen every version of foolishness. Evan's attorney introduced himself and began with a flourish about modernization, unstable ledgers, and a loving son-in-law taking hard stewardship to protect his volatile mother-in-law. He pronounced volatile as if it were a diagnosis. He held up the concierge doctor's letter like a talisman until the judge asked, without looking over her glasses, "Counselor, did this physician examine the plaintiff?" He faltered and admitted, "No, it was a general letter for insurance purposes." The judge leaned back. "Then put it away," she said. "We have enough waste paper in the world." Marisol stood, a compact presence, voice clear, and didn't bother with poetry. She ticked through the filings like someone checking a grocery list. Bank account changes without notice, new entities formed with near-identical names, vendor shells, misdirected deposits, and, she paused here, the messages. "Your Honor," she said, "the defendant conducted this scheme through devices logged into a single iCloud account he required the shop to use. These are his communications, preserved by a forensic specialist with chain of custody documentation we have marked as Exhibit C. We'll focus on a small set today." She clicked, and the Elmo flickered the first screenshot onto the wall. "I told Claire we're protecting her legacy. That word works like catnip. Lol, she still thinks the lease is in her name. Worst case, we burn the brand and reopen across town. She can keep the carcass." The air shifted. Courtrooms have their own weather. The judge glanced at Evan. "Is this your phone number?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, then mumbled that he couldn't be sure, and his attorney jumped in to sputter about context and banter. Marisol, as if she were pulling a good knife from a drawer, added the guardianship text. The judge pushed her glasses up and squinted. "Guardianship," she repeated, as if exploring the shape of the word in her mouth. Then she turned to Evan. "Sir, were you seeking guardianship over your mother-in-law?" Evan's attorney objected on grounds of tone, which made one law clerk cough a laugh. He turned into a cough. The judge ignored him. Evan said, "I was worried about her health." That was when Marisol produced the email from the concierge practice, clarifying that no exam had been conducted. The judge sighed, a sound like a tired teacher. "Counselor," she said to Evan's man, "this is the problem with believing you're clever is always benign. You have a client who wrote his case with his thumbs." Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Santos," she said, using my maiden name for reasons I still don't understand. "How old are you?" 61, Your Honor." "What is 1 plus 1? 2, I said. "What address is the Daily? Center?" 50 West Washington, I said, and the courtroom chuckled. She smiled, not warmly, but like a person acknowledging a good answer. "We're going to advance to the substance," she said, leaning forward. "Ms. Ortiz, continue." Marisol went methodically, sliding exhibits like plates to a table. Lydia had given us clean ledgers, highlighting duplicate payments. Junior had a printout of the iCloud login record, showing devices authorized by the shop email. The landlord had responded to our subpoena with a copy of the lease, signed by Evan under the holding company, with no other signatories. When the judge asked Evan why he had not included my name on the renewal, he said, "We were streamlining," and the judge murmured, "Into your pocket, it appears." He reddened. He said he'd loaned the business money, and Marisol held up a promissory note, witness signed by Vance, whose last name, when we gave it to the judge, made her eyebrows climb. She knew it. So did half the room. Vance had a reputation that smelled like bleach and cash. Then came the part that felt like a knot letting go. Marisol clicked to a text where Evan wrote to S. Judge knowledge. They're swayed by narratives. We push the helpless old lady angle hard. The judge's expression changed. Barely, but I saw it. The way you flinch when smoke blows across your face. She leaned toward the mic and said very quietly, "Open and shut." The court reporter raised her fingers, then set them down, unsure if she should capture that, and the judge waved her hand. "You can write that," she said. "I'd like that in the record." Evan's attorney sputtered that this was premature, that context matters, that venting is not admission. The judge held up a finger. "You will have your day," she said, "but today is not going your way." She turned to me again. "Mrs. Santos, what do you want?" I didn't know I'd be allowed to want out loud. My throat went tight. I looked at Claire, whose eyes were wet but steady. "I want my name back," I said. "I want the locks changed to my key. I want every dollar back that he took, plus the fees I paid to prove it. I want him barred from my building and my accounts. I want him to leave my daughter out of his mouth." The judge nodded. "Temporary restraining order granted," she said, as if reciting a recipe. "Defendant is enjoined from operating under the blue iris and vine mark, accessing premises at 33. She read the address. "And interacting with vendors or employees. Preliminary injunction hearing set for 30 days. Discovery is open. Counsel, you will provide a full accounting of all entities associated with the business within 2 weeks. Fail, and I will impose sanctions." She paused. "And gentlemen," she looked at Evan and his attorney, though the latter was a decent man caught in bad employment. "Advise your client to stop texting." We walked out into the hallway, where the light was different, bluer, like water. Evan followed, his jaw tight. "This is temporary," he said to Claire, loud enough to bounce off the glass. "You're ruining your chance at a real life." Claire stood like a tree. "I had a real life," she said. "You locked me out of it." He cursed. The security guard raised an eyelid. Evan's attorney put a hand on his arm, a small anchor. "Don't talk," he whispered. Evan tore his arm away, looked at me and said, "You think this is over? I will bury you in paper." I stared at him, then at the little rectangle of courtroom carpet that always looks like the weak spot in the floor. "I like paper," I said. "It talks." He turned on his heel and strode to the elevators, as if the speed could make the floor open and swallow us. It didn't. We rode down separate boxes and came out onto Washington, where the city clattered along as if none of us mattered. People went to work and lunch and divorce and marriage, and a man with a cart sold tamales that smelled like heaven. And I realized that while we had won a wall, we hadn't built the house yet. The house would require nails and inspections and those tiny shims you need when the wood doesn't sit quite right. It would require discovery. That night, Lydia, Jr., and Marisol sat around my table again, like a jury I had picked from people I trust. We made lists, subpoenas to banks and payment processors, deposition outlines, vendor interviews, a letter to the rental company that had installed the locks. We planned a surprise audit of inventory at the shop, a right we had under the old operating agreement, signed when the business was still simple. We would bring a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy if needed. "He will fight," Marisol said. "He will scream about harassment. He will tell everyone you're unstable. But he will hand over records because the court told him to. And if he doesn't, he will taste sanctions. Meanwhile, we will find Vance." "Find him?" I asked. "He's not hiding." "He will when he senses liability," she said. "People like him don't do well under oath." That night, I slept with the TRO taped inside my pantry door like a mezuzah, something you touch when you pass to remind yourself of your house. In the morning, I put on gloves and walked to my shop with a deputy and a locksmith. When the locksmith drilled, the sound was the nicest noise I'd heard in months. The door opened, the bell chimed, and the smell of greenery hit like a benediction. On the counter sat a bowl filled with business cards that said, "Rask Floral Concepts." I picked one up and laughed. The arrogance of printing before the fight. I dropped it in the trash. We took inventory. We photographed everything. We found a vendor catalog with handwritten notes about switching to cheaper roses after Mother's Day. We found a folder labeled Vendor Services, Confidential, with a post-it that read Shred. Lydia took it home and read it with a cup of tea while I swept the floor like a woman unlearning a sadness. Meanwhile, Junior discovered that the security camera still uploaded to the iCloud drive because arrogance forgets to flip switches. We watched footage of Evan meeting Vance after hours, exchanging envelopes like a parody of a bad movie. We pulled the stills, we time-stamped them, we added them to the stack and felt the paperwork tower grow. That afternoon, a neighbor named Rosa stopped by with a pie in a foil pan and gossip in her voice. "He told me you were sick," she said tartly. "I told him to eat rocks." She glanced around, took in the empty vases, the turned-up rugs. "We missed you." She handed me the pie, squeezed my arm, and left me there with a weight in my throat and a lightness under it. Neighborhoods remember. I wiped the counter. I put the pie on the staff table under the sign that says, "Wash your cups," in my handwriting. For the first time since the locks, I turned on the open sign, not for customers, but for myself. 2 days later, Evan's attorney emailed a preliminary accounting, thin, too neat, missing invoices we already had. Marisol wrote back and listed the omissions, attached exhibits, CC'd the court, and used the phrase willful obfuscation in a way that made me giggle. He replied that our tone was unbecoming. She didn't answer. She filed a motion to compel and requested fees. It felt like tightening screws on a door frame until it stops creaking. The day our motion to compel was granted, Claire got a message from a woman named Samantha. The subject line was, "I didn't know what he was doing." Samantha was the S in his texts, and she had been the one to read his drafts, the one to laugh at his jokes about my boomer stamina. Her email said she had quit his company. It said she had copies of purchase orders he'd made from my supplier at inflated rates, and she copied the PDF. That night, when we clicked the file, we found the note at the bottom. Per ER, bump by 15% for consult line item. Quiet. The quotation marks were his handcuffs. We added that exhibit to the stack, too. We suggested in a reply that Samantha speak to my attorney. Then we waited. Sometimes revenge is slow, not because you lack courage, but because paperwork moves on a river, and rivers have their own speed. And then, on a warm Thursday, when the EL screeched particularly bright, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Meet?" it read. "I don't want to be in this anymore." It was Vance. I looked at Marisol, and she looked back with one eyebrow. "Public place," she said. "Lots of light." We picked the Starbucks by the Harold Washington Library because it's full of people with laptops and the ghosts of chapters. Vance came in wearing a cap pulled low. He ordered a black coffee and sat opposite me, like a schoolboy. He smelled like cigarettes and hand soap. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was lower than I expected. "I want the truth," I said, "and I want you off my neck." He stared. He toyed with the lid of his cup. "He said you'd roll over," he muttered. "He misread the bloom," I said. He barked a laugh at that, despite himself. He didn't give me everything. Men like Vance never do. But he gave me enough. The structure of the vendor shell, the extra fees, the plan to rebrand under Rask Floral if the court dragged. He admitted to making the lock change happen. He admitted to being the witness on the promissory note, because nobody cares who witnesses those. He looked tired. He did not apologize. At the end, I asked him why he'd reached out. He stared at the window where the tracks from the L streaked the sky. "I hate court," he said, "and he's sloppy." He stood, left his coffee, and walked out into the afternoon, shoulders hunched, like he was trying to fold himself into nothing. I watched him go, then called Marisol. She said, "Good," and told me to breathe. I did, once and again. Then I went back to the shop and trimmed stems like a woman practicing for surgery. Depositions are where the smell of cologne meets the smell of paper. Evan arrived with his attorney and an air that said he was doing us a favor. He took the seat at the end of the table, like a captain claiming the prow. The court reporter swore him in, and he lifted his right hand as if swearing to the flag at an assembly. Marisol started easy. Names, dates, job history. He relaxed. His shoulders dropped. Then she took him through the shell entities. Vance's name came up. He said he didn't recall about 20 times. After the 15th, Marisol slid a photo across. The after-hours meeting, the envelope exchange. He stared at the glossy for a full beat, too long. "That could be anything," he said. "Is it you?" she asked. He stared. "It might be." "Is this your signature on the lease renewal?" she asked, sliding the page over, our copy from the landlord discovered in one of those industrial gray cabinets in their office that seemed to hold entire worlds. "Yes." "And is that my client's signature?" He paused. "It appears to be." "And did she sign it in your presence?" He shifted. "I don't recall." He said it softly, as if softness could make the lie less sharp. Marisol waited. Silence is a tool most people don't use enough. He fidgeted, then added, "She was there," the court reporter typed. And I thought, men like this think every room is theirs until a woman refuses to fill the silence for them. When Marisol turned to the texts, his attorney objected to relevance, to foundation, to characterizations that were inflammatory. Marisol laid the groundwork. Forensic download, chain of custody, Apple's authentication. She didn't hurry. Then she put one page in the center of the table. Worst case, we burn the brand and reopen across town. She didn't ask a question. She waited. The room hummed with the air conditioner and the tiny click of the reporter's keys. Finally, Evan said, "That was a joke." "Who laughed?" Marisol asked, without looking up. His eyebrow twitched. "Vance." "Is it funny to talk about burning a woman's business? Is it funny to lock her out?" Silence again. "Is it funny to talk about guardianship while drafting a physician letter?" His jaw clenched. "I care about Claire," he said, deflecting to the one human shield he had left. "And yet you called her catnip," she said, sliding that page onto the stack. "When you referred to her reaction to legacy?" He flushed. "Private jokes," he muttered. Marisol leaned back, her chair creaking. "Mr. Rask," she said, "have you ever been deposed before?" "No," "It shows," she said. The court reporter made a sound like a suppressed cough. His attorney stared at his cuticles. We took a break. I stepped into the hallway, where the carpet was aggressively beige, and leaned against a cold spot on the wall. Claire joined me. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. In 10 minutes, we had watched a man try to charm his way past documentation and fail. It was a small chapter in a long book, but it was a chapter with footnotes. After the break, Marisol asked about the doctor's letter. Evan said he had approached the concierge practice for general wellness, and they had overinterpreted his request. Marisol produced the email chain, showing he had asked for a letter, attesting to the possibility of cognitive decline for insurance purposes. He glared. "You don't like me," he said. "This is personal." "It's legal," she said. "And it's true." When we left the deposition, the loop's shadows were long, and the air tasted like rain that hadn't decided whether to fall. Evan's attorney attempted conciliation in the elevator, lingering on the phrases mutual non-disparagement and global settlement. Marisol said we would consider offers after full accounting. He nodded as if he'd expected that, then turned to Evan and whispered something I couldn't hear. Evan's face curdled. The elevator dinged, and we stepped into a hallway where the steam pipes hissed and a janitor pushed a cart with a radio playing Old Soul. I loved that the city's soundtrack didn't care what we'd just done. Over the next weeks, the war became a routine. Motions, replies, small victories. The judge issued an order compelling production of emails from Evan's work account that he had used to coordinate vendor shells. He fought it, claiming privacy. And the judge looked over her glasses and said, "Your client used this account to run a business, with the plaintiff's name on it. There is no privacy in theft." He produced a begrudging trickle. We showed the judge the missing pieces. She said, "Sanctions." The way my mother used to say, "grounded." He turned the spigot. We found two things that mattered. A spreadsheet titled BIV Flow, mapping the money like a sewer plan, and an email from his friend at the landlord's office flagging my age with the note, "Trust me, this is the window." I wanted to tear that email to confetti and throw it into the river. Marisol said, "Let it hang him." The preliminary injunction hearing arrived on a day when the lake was steel and everyone wore jackets like they were armoring up. The courtroom bench creaked when we sat. Evan held himself in that peculiar way of men who play squash and never sweat, a stiffness that reads as polish from a distance and as insecurity up close. His attorney did his job, argued about innovation and stagnation, and the need for stable, modern leadership. He said my hand with the ledger was old-fashioned. He said romance doesn't reconcile accounts. The judge listened, face smooth, then asked, "Is romance what you call signatures?" He said the right words about alleged forgery being for another day. She nodded, then asked him where, in his story, the plaintiff consented to losing her name. He stared like a boy asked to explain algebra he memorized, but never learned. Marisol, for her part, assembled our story like a patient aunt. She put up the flows, played us a snippet from a voicemail, where Evan told a vendor to route future invoices to the new umbrella, and then, like a dessert, placed the open and shut set of texts, where he mocked the judge's supposed susceptibility to narratives. The judge chuckled, lightly, like a warning, and said, "This is not a narrative court. This is the Circuit Court of Cook County." Then she granted the preliminary injunction, ordered him to post a bond twice the amount he'd siphoned in case we prevailed, and referred the forged signature to the state's attorney for review. Evan's mouth fell open a fraction, a flower in reverse. When we stepped into the hallway, the flush on Claire's cheeks looked like the color of a girl who ran hard and won. Evan came up, his movements jerkier now. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said. I looked at his shoes, polished enough to reflect fluorescence. "I do," I said. "I'm messing with a man whose shoes squeak when he's afraid." He looked down, reflexively, and the absurdity of it made Claire snort laughter that broke the tension like a snapped stem lets the scent out. We went home and ate pizza on paper plates at my kitchen table. I poured wine. Lydia toasted the phrase, "open and shut." Junior toasted chain of custody. Marisol toasted the lake. Claire toasted me. I toasted the neighborhood and the pie from Rosa and the locksmith's drill. And Lou, Mitchell's eggs, and every woman in that courthouse walking into rooms where men say no and paper says yes. I also toasted the patience required for more, the forensic accountant's report, the state's attorney's decision, the check that would someday arrive with the notation, settlement. I toasted sleep. We slept. 2 weeks later, the state's attorney called Marisol and used the phrase, "interested in further information." We gave it. A week after that, they asked to interview me. I sat in a bland conference room with a woman who wore sneakers with her suit and told my story again, slower. She took notes and asked how often I had signed my name. "Every day," I said, "on invoices and sympathy cards and checks to girls saving for college." She nodded. She asked whether I had ever authorized Evan to sign for me. I said no. I asked if this would end in handcuffs. She said she didn't know. She said the law is a house you build with what you have. I do not know if it was me or the texts or the Vance photograph or the doctor's email that finally made it collapse. But one Friday, Evan's attorney called Marisol and said the word settlement in the tone of a man asking for the weather to change. We met in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The lake lay outside like a cold sheet. He offered pennies. We countered. He raised. We set a number, full restitution of siphoned funds, damages, fees, an acknowledgement letter he would sign that admitted no guilt but stated plain truth, that I had not retired, that he was not owner, that the brand was mine. We added a clause that barred him from doing business under any name with any part of mine in it. Within 50 miles for 5 years. He balked. We did not. He went into the hall, came back, and said yes. He did not look at me. The money arrived in a wire 3 days later, prefaced by a PDF of a letter with his signature. I printed it, pinned it to the corkboard by my phone, and stared at his name until it lost its shape. The state's attorney went on with their file, and I did not ask for updates, not because I didn't care, but because revenge, once achieved, becomes something else if you keep feeding it. I had a shop to reopen. We had a grand reopening to plan. We put the sign back to the old font. We took out the Rask cards and burned them in a coffee can in the alley like old leaves. On the morning we reopened, there was a light rain, the kind that makes petals look like glass. Claire arrived early, hair damp, carrying bagels. Lydia brought coffee. Junior brought a new paw system he configured himself. Rosa brought a pie. At 8, I unlocked the door and flipped the sign. The bell chimed, and Mrs. Patel from the bodega down the block came in with a grin and bought tulips, then a teacher, then a cop's wife, then a man with a suit who needed a bouquet for a meeting. We wrapped stems and tied ribbon and tucked cards, each one signed by hand. We were happy. We were busy. At noon, someone sent an arrangement from a secret admirer, and the lilies made me snort. We put them in the back. When the day wound down, I stood in the doorway and watched the neighborhood move. The air smelled like wet concrete and basil. The elves shrieked in a way that felt like an orchestra tuning rather than a scream. Claire leaned on the counter and asked if I was tired. I said yes in the way you say yes when it is a good ache. Then my phone chimed. It was an unknown number. "Congratulations," the text read. No emoji, no name. I didn't respond. I put the phone down. I picked up the broom and swept my floor, my shop, my square of Chicago, like a woman who knows that keeping your house is the best revenge of all. A month later, the judge signed the final order. The bond returned, the accounting closed, the settlement funds, minus fees, sat in a new account that Lydia named with a flourish: Blue, Iris, and Vine. Future. I laughed at how that word felt in my mouth. I took Claire to Margie's Candies and bought us sundaes like we were teenagers who had just passed our driver's test. We talked about expanding the workshop space, about teaching bouquet classes on Wednesday nights, about hiring the kid from down the block who draws like a dream to paint a mural on the side of the building. We did not talk about Evan. He existed in the past tense, a lesson laminated and put in a binder. And yet, some nights I walked past the Picasso at sunset and thought about the way the judge said, "Open and shut," and felt a thrill like the city itself had said my name. Some mornings I woke and reached for my spiral notebook out of habit, the one where I had written my truths. I added a final line. Truth number 6. On the day someone thinks you are easiest to erase, you are often the sharpest pencil in the drawer. People asked me afterward if I had forgiven him. It's a reasonable question in a country that sells forgiveness like an oil change. I told them I didn't think about him much. That was also true. When I did, it was not forgiveness I considered, but gratitude for the stupid things he wrote. Without them, we would still be in the fog. With them, we found the road. His arrogance built my ladder. We did the first Wednesday workshop in November. The classroom smelled like cinnamon and damp leaves. 10 women, 2 men, 1 teenager, a grandmother with bracelets that jangled when she cut stems. We set out buckets of mums and eucalyptus and that delicious purple-blue thistle. We talked about balance and volume and the trick of letting a bouquet turn in your hand like it's alive. A woman in a red coat cried when she made a wreath. That looked like my mother's, and we all pretended we weren't crying too. At the end, Claire counted the till, and I wrote 3 checks, 1 to the food pantry, 1 to a scholarship fund for a girl at the high school who wants to study design, 1 to the legal clinic where Marisol gives her Mondays. I wrote the amounts with a steady hand. My arthritis had been gentle that week. On a Tuesday in December, a letter arrived from the state's attorney, a copy of an indictment naming Evan on a charge related to forgery. I sat at my table and read it until the words blurred. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel sorry. I felt like someone had closed a door very softly. I put the letter in a folder labeled Law because flair is for bouquets. Winter made the city bright with ice. Business slowed the way all flower shops slow in January. We lifted our spirits by ordering too many ranunculus for practice arrangements. One night, in that deep cold when your breath feels like it might snap, I stayed late to finish a sympathy wreath. When I finished, I walked to the door to flip the sign, and through the glass, I saw a figure on the sidewalk. A man in a wool coat, hands in pockets. He looked up. It was Evan. He didn't move closer. He didn't gesture. He simply stood there, an outline cut out of the night. I felt Claire step up beside me, like she'd been pulled by a string. We stood shoulder to shoulder, and I flipped the sign slowly from open to closed while looking him in the eye. He watched us. Then he turned and walked away, his breath a ghost. I latched the door. Claire exhaled. "Do you think he'll bother us?" she asked. I shook my head. "He's learned we're expensive," I said. We laughed, a small wind in a small room that is ours. I thought about texting Marisol, then decided against it. There are moments you keep and moments you report. This one I kept like a pressed petal in a book. Spring came like it always does, arrogant and kind. The tulips turned their cups to the light. Graduation parties booked arrangements. A bride cried at a mock-up and then hugged me so hard my back popped. I showed a kid how to strip rose thorns without shredding his thumb, and he looked at me like I was a magician. I told him it's just repetition and respect for the flower. He nodded like I'd said something wise. Maybe I had. Sometimes, in the quiet after close, I take out the Ziploc with the cracked iPhone. I keep it in a shoebox with old photos and the ticket stub from the night Claire and I saw the Blackhawks lose in overtime and still ate nachos like winners. I don't look at the phone because I need to. I look at it to remember the weight of what nearly erased me. It's heavier than it looks. Information usually is. Once, I held it in my palm and said out loud to nobody, open and shut, just to feel how it rang in the room. Not long ago, a woman came in with a copy of that neighborhood magazine, the issue with Evan in my apron. She slapped it on the counter and said, "You want me to complain to them?" I laughed. "No," I said. "Bring me a frame." She looked confused. "A frame?" "Yes," I said, "a nice one. Gold." She did. I hung that page in the back, where staff can see it when they're washing cups. I wrote a little card under it that says, "In my block hand, remember." We are not our enemies' stories. Every time a kid clocks in and sees that, I hope they understand. People assume the final line of a story like, "This is a moral." I don't have one. I have a business. I have a daughter whose eyes are clear. I have a judge's voice in my head that pronounces justice like a step stool. I have a city that smells like onions at lunch and Daphne in May and printer ink at 9 a.m. And always, always, the metal hum of a train. I have proof. And sometimes, when the bell over my door rings and a stranger says, "Is this the place that fought that case?" I smile and say, "This is the place that wrapped your grandmother's favorite flower in brown paper with a note. That's who we are." Then I tie the twine and watch them carry something delicate back out into a place that can be cruel, and decide, that's enough, that's revenge. And on rare nights when the shop is dark and the street's shine lies like a ribbon on the floor, I stand at the counter with my hands flat and think of the bench outside courtroom 2508. The chipped edge, the slightly sticky spot where someone spilled a latte. I hear his whisper, and I hear the judge, and in the space between those two voices, I hear my own, steady as water on stone. That's the voice I live by now. That's what I keep. And that is why, when people ask me if I'd do it again, the suit, the subpoenas, the wearing down of my shoes, I say yes. Because some doors open only when you prove you own the key. And I do. The end.